Smoke rose from the Pacific in a column thick enough to be seen for miles. An American aircraft carrier steel giant of the modern age burned where it had been struck. The flight deck, once a smooth expanse of painted lines and rushing crews, was twisted and torn. Heat warped the planks. Fires crawled along aviation fuel lines. The ship no longer looked like a weapon. It looked like wreckage still afloat. Below the deck, elevators were frozen between levels, bent by blast force and jammed by debris. Electrical systems failed in patches. Steam lines ruptured. Compartments flooded unevenly. Men fought the fire with hoses, foam, and exhaustion, knowing that a single mistake could finish what the bombs had started. This was the kind of damage navies studied as terminal too complex, too deep, too interconnected to undo quickly. Across the ocean, Japanese planners studied reports with professional satisfaction. The assessment was methodical, unemotional. A carrier so damaged was effectively removed from the war. Even if she survived the fires, the distance to American shipyards meant months of transit and repair, perhaps longer. In a war measured by tempo, that absence mattered more than sinking. A carrier out of action was, for all strategic purposes, gone. Intelligence officers penciled timelines into planning charts. They marked the ship as neutralized. Operations assumed a gap would open in American carrier strength, a window of opportunity carved by steel and flame. The numbers aligned. Doctrine confirmed it. History supported the conclusion. No fleet absorbed such damage and returned quickly. It simply was not how naval war worked. Yet days passed. Then reports shifted in tone. The carrier was not limping east in retreat. She was moving slowly at first, then with purpose. Signals indicated restored power. Flight operations resumed in limited form. Aircraft, tentative at first, began landing again on a deck that intelligence had declared unusable. The assumption of removal collapsed quietly, without ceremony. There was no announcement, no declaration of failure, just confusion. How could a ship, marked as finished, still function? How could repairs that required dry docks and months be undone at sea, under threat and under time pressure? The answer was not visible from the air. It did not sit on the flight deck or fly overhead. It waited elsewhere, already at work, unseen, uncounted, and about to overturn everything Japan believed it understood about how wars were won. Japanese naval planners did not rely on hope or bravado. They relied on numbers. Carrier warfare, as they understood it, was an equation governed by distance, industrial capacity, and time. Every damaged American flat top was plotted against the map of the Pacific, measured not only by the bombs it had absorbed, but by how far it now lay from salvation. The arithmetic was unforgiving. The nearest fully equipped American shipyards sat thousands of miles east, beyond Hawaii, beyond the reach of contested seas. Even Pearl Harbor, still scarred from its own wounds, lacked the dry docks, heavy cranes, and industrial depth required to rebuild a modern carrier. It could patch hulls and restore propulsion. It could not realign flight decks or replace warped elevator systems. For that, ships had to go home, and home was very far away. Carriers were not destroyers. They were not cargo ships with spare steel and simple lines. They were floating ecosystems, electrical grids, layered atop aviation fuel systems, steam catapults intertwined with structural supports, flight operations dependent on tolerances measured in inches. Damage in one compartment cascaded into dozens of systems. No navy, Japanese planners believed, could improvise that complexity back into fighting shape. Attrition, therefore, was not about sinking ships. It was about removing them from the calendar. A carrier damaged today would not threaten tomorrow's operation or next month's. Each successful strike widened the gap between American capacity and American presence. The logic was clean. Lose enough carriers to repair queues, and the operational tempo would collapse on its own. Japanese timetables reflected this confidence. Campaigns were sequenced on the assumption that American carriers would vanish from the battle space faster than they could return. Windows of dominance were calculated in weeks, sometimes months. Within those windows, Japan would strike again, consolidating gains while the enemy limped backward across the Pacific. The numbers did not lie, or so it seemed. Every doctrine, every historical precedent, reinforced the conclusion. Distance was destiny. Industrial power mattered only if it could be brought to bear in time. And time, the planners believed, was something Japan could control by force. What these calculations did not question was their own foundation. They assumed repair was static, tied to geography and concrete docks. They assumed recovery moved at the speed of bureaucracy and steel. And they assumed that war rewarded destruction more reliably than endurance. On paper, the war already leaned their way. But beneath those precise columns of figures, an uncounted variable waited, one that would soon render the math irrelevant. Beneath the visible fleet below the carriers, cruisers, and destroyers that dominated reconnaissance photographs, another force moved across the Pacific. It did not announce itself with aircraft launches or gunfire. It waited below decks and beyond headlines, following the combat formations at a distance measured not in miles, but in readiness. These ships carried no strike squadrons and mounted no heavy guns. Their silhouettes were ungainly, their decks cluttered not with aircraft but with vents, cranes, and exhaust stacks. To an outside observer, they appeared unremarkable support vessels, easily dismissed. Yet inside their steel hulls were workshops more complete than many shore facilities, designed not to fight battles, but to erase their consequences. Where a carrier stored planes, these ships housed machine tools. Lathes spun day and night. Welders cut and fused warped steel. Foundries melted scrap into replacement parts shaped by hand and necessity. Power plants fed not propulsion alone, but entire industrial ecosystems afloat. What could not be shipped forward would be built where the damage occurred. The men aboard them were not sailors in the traditional sense. They were machinists, electricians, pattern makers, and engineers, many pulled directly from civilian industry. They understood tolerances, stresses, and failure modes. They could read blueprints that no longer matched reality and still produce solutions. When battle damage defied manuals, they improvised, guided by experience rather than doctrine. These vessels sailed quietly. They were rarely photographed, seldom named in communiques, and almost never celebrated. Their work happened at anchorages, in lagoons, and sometimes within range of enemy aircraft. When they finished, they slipped away again, leaving behind ships that were supposed to be gone. Japanese intelligence never truly saw them. They did not fit existing categories of power. They were not counted in carrier tallies or battleship ratios. No war plan accounted for floating factories that could restore combat capability without retreat. In the calculus of attrition, they simply did not exist. But while planners counted losses and distances, these ships were already changing the rules. They were shortening timelines, collapsing assumptions, and turning damage into delay rather than defeat. And as the Pacific War accelerated, the quiet fleet beneath the fleet would begin to matter more than anyone on the other side had imagined. For generations, navies understood recovery as a fixed geography. Warships fought forward, but they healed backward. Damage sustained at sea was measured not only by severity, but by how far the wounded hull lay from a home yard. The deeper a fleet operated into hostile waters, the more fragile it became, not because of enemy fire alone, but because of distance from repair. Dry docks defined this reality. They were the cathedrals of naval power. Concrete basins, massive cranes, calibrated rails, and specialized labor that no ship could carry with it. Only there could a hull be realigned, a shaft pulled, a deck re-leveled. Without dry dock access, even a surviving warship existed in a state of compromise. Operable, perhaps, but not whole. Distance, therefore, equaled vulnerability. Every mile from home stretched repair timelines and narrowed options. A damaged ship in forward waters faced a simple choice: withdraw and recover, or remain and degrade. History suggested that most chose the former. Navies preserved capital ships by pulling them back, accepting temporary absence as the price of long-term strength. Japanese doctrine was built upon this assumption. Repair, by definition, meant retreat. A carrier struck hard enough to disrupt flight operations was operationally dead until it returned to the industrial core. It might float, it might survive, but it would not fight. In planning rooms, such ships were crossed off not because they were sunk, but because they were removed from the present. This way of thinking shaped everything from campaign design to pilot expectations. Damaged enemy ships were written off as neutralized threats, even when still afloat. Follow-up strikes targeted what remained active, not what had already been solved. Time, it was believed, would finish the work that bombs had begun. Logistics, in this worldview, remained subordinate to combat. They were enablers, not actors, background necessities that supported decisive engagements, but did not alter them. Victory came from superior tactics, better pilots, and the courage to press attacks at the right moment. Supply and repair were essential, but passive. They followed the war. They did not lead it. This assumption was not uniquely Japanese. It was nearly universal. European navies had fought within reach of ports. American planners had long relied on continental shipyards. Even in theory, mobile repair was discussed cautiously, framed as emergency patchwork rather than strategic capability. No one expected repair to keep pace with combat. The belief endured because it had always worked. Wars ended before industrial depth was fully tested. Fleets either broke through or withdrew. There was little precedent for sustained, high-intensity naval warfare conducted at the far edge of supply, where retreat itself became a liability. So planners trusted what history had taught them. Ships would fight, shipyards would repair, and the space between the two would decide who could stay in the war. What they did not yet grasp was that one navy was quietly collapsing that space, turning repair into something mobile, immediate, and inseparable from combat itself. Carrier warfare, as Japan understood it in 1941 and 1942, was inherently fragile. A carrier was not simply a ship, it was a balance of precision systems layered atop one another. Disrupt the flight deck, disable the elevators, rupture aviation fuel lines, and the entire structure ceased to function as a weapon. To Japanese planners, this fragility was not a weakness but an opportunity. It meant that a single, well-executed strike could neutralize months, sometimes years of industrial effort. This belief was reinforced by experience. Early successes in the Pacific had demonstrated how quickly air power could cripple capital ships. Bombs and torpedoes did not need to sink carriers outright. They only needed to make flight operations impossible. A carrier unable to launch or recover aircraft was, in effect, absent from the war. That absence was what mattered most. Behind this logic sat assumptions about industry. Complex machines, Japanese analysts believed, could not be repaired quickly because they could not be repaired everywhere. Specialized components required specialized factories. Skilled labor was concentrated ashore, not afloat. Industrial bottlenecks were inevitable, and once created, they would govern the pace of recovery. The enemy's productive strength mattered less than how long it took to convert that strength into restored ships. American flexibility was therefore underestimated, not out of ignorance, but out of logic shaped by Japan's own experience. The Imperial Navy's repair capacity was centralized, hierarchical, and methodical. Damage flowed back to fixed yards, where authority and tooling resided. It was efficient, but it was not fast. Intelligence analysts assumed their enemy operated the same way. Repair capacity, in this view, was measured in ports. How many dry docks existed? How many cranes? How many miles of rail connected factories to the sea? Ships were repaired by places, not by people. If a carrier could not reach those places, its fate was sealed by geography alone. What rarely entered the calculation was speed. Recovery time was treated as a constant, not a variable. Months were assumed because months had always been required. The idea that timelines could be compressed radically, repeatedly, under combat conditions seemed unrealistic. Warships were not meant to be rebuilt forward. Doctrine said so. History agreed. Confidence grew from this miscalculation. Each damaged American carrier reinforced the belief that attrition was working as intended. Planners saw gaps opening and assumed they would widen naturally. There was no urgency to rethink assumptions that appeared to be confirmed by events. Yet the confidence rested on a narrow definition of damage, one that equated destruction with delay and delay with defeat. It left no room for an adversary who treated repair itself as a weapon. And somewhere beyond the maps and reports, Americans were already learning how to make damage temporary faster than Japan believed possible. American naval planners entered the Pacific War with a fear that outweighed even enemy fire. It was not the bomb or the torpedo that troubled them most, but distance. The ocean itself, vast, empty, and indifferent, posed a strategic threat unlike anything faced in the Atlantic or Mediterranean. In the Pacific, a damaged ship did not merely risk defeat, it risked disappearance. This awareness shaped American thinking long before the first shots were fired. At war colleges and planning tables, officers studied not only how ships were lost, but how they returned. Repair was not treated as an afterthought or an administrative burden. It was examined as a form of strategy, an extension of combat power that determined whether victories could be sustained or squandered. Engineers were therefore embedded into operational planning in ways that surprised foreign observers. They were not confined to shore establishments or technical bureaus. They sailed with fleets, advised commanders, and participated in decision-making. Their role was not to make ships perfect, but to keep them usable. Function, not restoration, became the guiding principle. The Pacific demanded this mindset. There were no friendly ports spaced conveniently along the Advance. Each mile west stretched supply lines thinner and multiplied the cost of retreat. American planners understood that if every damaged ship had to return home, momentum would collapse under its own weight. The war would be lost, not in battle, but in transit. The solution was radical in its simplicity. Bring the yard forward. Instead of treating shipyards as fixed places, the U.S. places, Navy began to think of them as capabilities, collections of tools, power, and skilled labor that could be moved where needed. Repair no longer had to wait for concrete docks and towering cranes. It could happen wherever a ship could anchor. Thus, shipyards were designed to float. Hulls were laid down not to launch aircraft or fire guns, but to carry machine shops intact across the ocean. Power generation was scaled to industrial levels. Tooling was duplicated and standardized. What could not be transported was redesigned until it could be fabricated on the spot. Mobility became resilience. A fleet that could repair itself forward was a fleet that could absorb punishment without surrendering initiative. Damage no longer dictated withdrawal. It imposed delay, and delay could be managed. Time became elastic, something to be compressed rather than endured. This doctrine diverged quietly from established naval tradition. There were no declarations, no dramatic announcements. It emerged through memoranda, exercises, and incremental changes that only later revealed their full significance. While others counted ships, American planners began counting hours, how long a carrier could be out of action before it mattered. By the time the war reached its most violent phase, this obsession with staying in the fight had hardened into doctrine. And waiting just beyond the horizon were the ships that made it possible, ready to prove that endurance, not destruction, would decide the Pacific War. The first American repair ships sent west were never meant to carry the weight they soon would. They were conversions, improvised platforms drawn from tenders, cargo hulls, and aging auxiliaries. Their machine shops were small, their power limited, their ambitions modest. In peacetime, they had serviced destroyers and patrol craft. In war, they were suddenly expected to resurrect capital ships. Reality arrived quickly. Battle damage bore little resemblance to scheduled overhauls. Steel did not bend cleanly. Bulkheads cracked along unpredictable seams. Heat-warped structures that blueprints insisted were straight. The orderly logic of dockyard repair collapsed under the chaos of combat. What worked in calm harbors failed under salt air, vibration, and time pressure. Engineers learned fast because they had no choice. Peacetime assumptions were stripped away, replaced by a single requirement: make it work now. Ships were no longer repaired back to specification. They were restored to function. A flight deck did not need to be perfect. It needed to hold aircraft safely enough to launch and recover. Precision gave way to sufficiency, and sufficiency became survival. This shift demanded redesign not of carriers, but of the repair ships themselves. Workshops were expanded until they rivaled shore facilities. Decks were reconfigured to support heavier tools. Storage spaces became libraries of raw material: steel plate, copper stock, electrical cable, valve assemblies. The repair ship ceased to be a support vessel and became something closer to a mobile factory. Power generation emerged as the central constraint. Lathes, welders, and foundries devoured electricity. Early ships strained under the load, lights dimming as machines spun up. The solution was brutal and effective. Install more generators, larger ones, dedicated solely to industrial work. Repair ships began producing power not for propulsion, but for creation. Electricity became as critical as fuel. Spare parts posed another problem. No two ships were damaged in quite the same way, and inventories could never predict every failure. The answer was standardization on a scale rarely attempted. Components were redesigned to be interchangeable across classes. Bolts, fittings, valves, and assemblies were simplified and unified. When a part did not exist, it was fabricated. When fabrication failed, the design itself was altered. Failures did not end when ships sailed. They were corrected at sea, sometimes within sight of the enemy. Welders worked while hulls rolled gently at anchor. Machinists cut replacement shafts, while engines still ticked with heat. Every repair taught a lesson, and every lesson was fed back into the system. What broke once was strengthened the next time. Out of this struggle, a new class of ship emerged, not defined by armament or speed, but by capability. These vessels carried no glamour, but they changed the character of the fleet. Damage no longer meant retreat. It meant rendezvous. Carriers began to operate with the knowledge that if they survived the strike, they could survive the aftermath. This transformation did not happen in a single moment. It accumulated through error, exhaustion, and stubborn refusal to accept limits. Each successful repair shortened the war by a fraction, though no one could yet measure how much. What mattered was that the fleet no longer waited for recovery. It brought recovery with it. And as these floating workshops perfected their craft, they prepared to face the true test, repairing ships that, by every traditional standard, were never meant to fight again. When the damaged carriers arrived, they no longer resembled the ships drawn in design offices. Steel was twisted where bombs had struck at angles no engineer could predict. Flight decks sagged or buckled, their carefully calculated tolerances erased by heat and shock. Elevator shafts were no longer square. Frames meant to carry aircraft loads now bore the memory of explosions. Blueprints offered little comfort. They described an ideal ship, symmetrical, aligned, untouched by combat. What lay before the repair crews was something else entirely. A structure altered by violence. Measurements no longer matched. Reference points had shifted. The ship had become a unique problem, shaped by the randomness of battle rather than the order of design. Repairs therefore began without certainty. There was no checklist for a deck bent 3 inches out of true. No manual for wiring scorched by aviation fuel fires. Engineers walked the damage, chalking lines directly onto steel, deciding in real time what could be saved and what had to be cut away. Solutions were not chosen for elegance, but for speed and reliability. Much of this work happened in open water. Carriers anchored in lagoons or roadsteads, far from dry docks, exposed to weather and threat. The sea never stopped moving. Welding torches flared as hulls rolled gently beneath them. Sparks fell into the water. Crews adjusted by instinct, learning how to compensate for motion that shore yards never faced. When parts were missing or shattered beyond reuse, they were built from nothing. Raw steel was cut, shaped, and drilled by hand. Shafts were turned on lathes that vibrated with the ship's engines. Brackets, valves, and fittings were fabricated to fit damage that no standard part could match. Each piece was a one-off, made to restore function, not perfection. The work did not pause. Crews operated in shifts that blurred together 24 hours a day, guided by floodlights and exhaustion. Sleep was taken when possible, often on the shop deck itself. The urgency was not abstract. Every hour, the carrier remained inactive, reshaped operational plans across the fleet. Every delay rippled outward. Time became the enemy, more than damage itself. Fire and steel had done their worst in minutes. Repair now fought against days measured in lost sorties and missed opportunities. Engineers learned to prioritize ruthlessly. Cosmetic damage was ignored. Structural compromises were accepted if they held. The standard was simple. Could the ship fight? Often, the answer came sooner than anyone expected. Flight decks reopened with temporary plating. Elevators operated at reduced capacity. Systems ran hot, strained, imperfect, but they ran. Aircraft returned, cautiously at first. Then in numbers, what had been written off as wreckage resumed its place in the order of battle. These recoveries were never complete. They were calculated risks, accepted because the alternative was absence. Each carrier that returned carried scars beneath fresh paint. Each sortie flew from a deck that had been bent back into usefulness by men working against time and assumption. And with every successful repair, one truth became clearer. The war would not be decided by whose ships were built strongest, but by whose ships could be returned to service fastest. Operational pressure allowed little time for restoration. Aerial activity continued steadily, monitoring anchorages and forward areas where damaged vessels were brought together. Observation aircraft scanned lagoons and harbors for familiar outlines, aware that wherever disabled carriers remained, strategic opportunity followed. The pace of operations allowed no pause for recovery to fully conclude. Support and repair ships carried out their work close to active zones. They lacked heavy protection, carried no aviation facilities for defense, and possessed limited speed for rapid withdrawal. Their safety relied on concealment and careful positioning. Fleets adapted by distributing damaged ships across broad anchorages, reducing recognizable patterns that could be easily observed. Smoke screens softened visual definition, while camouflage measures reduced contrast against the surrounding sea. Crews adjusted to routines shaped by constant alertness. Tools were set aside when aircraft were heard approaching and resumed shortly after the area cleared. Equipment remained in place. Personnel memorized movement paths and returned to their assignments without instruction. Working under interruption became a practiced discipline, refined until hesitation disappeared. This environment clarified priorities. Each task was weighed against the likelihood of sudden interruption. Work was divided into stages that could withstand abrupt pauses. Backup planning became standard practice. If one team had to withdraw, another could continue seamlessly. Progress persisted not because conditions were ideal, but because delay posed greater risk than exposure. Each hour recovered influenced operational calculations. Restoring a carrier even a day earlier meant aircraft availability remained intact. Escort formations stayed assigned, plans held, and momentum continued. Opposing planners expected gaps to emerge periods when carriers would be unavailable. Instead, those intervals steadily narrowed or disappeared. Carriers returned to service more quickly than anticipated. Some reappeared within weeks rather than months. Others resumed duty with temporary modifications and limited systems, yet remained capable of participation. For opposing aircrews, the effect was disorienting. Vessels previously assessed as severely damaged were observed operating once more. Reports grew inconsistent. Assessments conflicted with new sightings. Observers questioned earlier conclusions. Timelines were repeatedly adjusted. Predictable patterns of loss became increasingly difficult to interpret. The opposing force appeared able to withstand sustained pressure without conceding position. By the time planners began recognizing the trend, the underlying process remained unseen. The outcome was visible carriers that did not remain absent, but the mechanism was overlooked. Repair vessels operated quietly, their movements rarely tracked, their influence undervalued. It seemed as though industrial capacity itself had moved closer to operational areas. The contest between disruption and restoration unfolded steadily, measured in hours rather than dramatic moments. Damage occurred quickly. Recovery reclaimed in days what had been expected to take far longer. The balance shifted not through a single decisive change, but through accumulated advantage. And as expectations increasingly diverged from reality, the return of one carrier would soon make the transformation unmistakable, revealing that a fundamental shift in the character of the war had already taken place. The turning point did not announce itself with a new weapon or a decisive battle. It arrived quietly, carried on recognition. In the midst of combat operations, a familiar American carrier appeared where it should not have been on station, launching aircraft, functioning as if the past weeks had not happened. Japanese pilots saw it first. From altitude, the silhouette was unmistakable. As they descended, hull markings confirmed what their reports had already begun to suggest. This was a ship they had struck hard. A ship listed as crippled. A ship that, according to every estimate, should still have been limping east or lying silent at anchor. The sight produced hesitation. Pilots radioed back with uncertainty in their voices. Some assumed a mistake, others a misidentification. Yet as sorties continued, the evidence accumulated. Aircraft launched from that deck with practiced rhythm. Recovery cycles ran smoothly. The carrier was not merely present, it was operational. Intelligence officers struggled to reconcile the contradiction. Damage assessments from previous engagements were pulled and reviewed. Photographs were re-examined. Reports that had once seemed conclusive now felt inadequate. Fires had been extensive. Structural damage severe. By established standards, recovery should have taken months. Instead, the ship had returned in a fraction of that time. This single reappearance triggered a cascade of doubt. If one carrier could return so quickly, how many others might do the same? Previous assumptions about attrition began to unravel. Losses that had been counted as strategic victories were suddenly suspect. The certainty that damage equaled absence no longer held. Strike planning suffered immediately. Japanese operations relied on windows periods when American carrier strength was expected to be reduced. These windows dictated timing, routes, and force allocation. Now, those calculations could not be trusted. A carrier believed to be neutralized might reappear without warning, altering the balance at the moment of contact. Psychological shock spread through the ranks. Pilots who had risked their lives to deliver crippling blows questioned whether their efforts had achieved anything lasting. Planners faced a deeper unease. The enemy seemed to recover faster than experience allowed. The war's logic was changing beneath them. Attrition, once predictable, now behaved erratically. Ships vanished and returned. Damage inflicted did not translate cleanly into advantage. The relationship between effort and outcome blurred. Japanese commanders could still fight, still strike, still destroy, but they could no longer be certain that destruction endured. The carrier itself bore the marks of its ordeal. Temporary plating, altered structures, systems running close to their limits. It was not fully healed. It did not need to be. It only needed to fly aircraft, and it did. Function had replaced restoration as the measure of success. This moment marked more than surprise. It revealed a hidden asymmetry. One side fought to destroy ships. The other fought to erase the effects of destruction. One counted damage. The other counted time. From that point forward, Japanese planners faced an enemy whose strength could no longer be reduced on schedule. The war did not tilt suddenly, but it began to lean. And with that realization came a deeper fear, that the rules governing naval warfare itself had shifted, and that Japan was now fighting a war whose logic no longer favored it. The implications of faster repair extended far beyond the survival of individual ships. What began as an engineering solution evolved into a force multiplier that reshaped combat itself. A carrier restored days or weeks ahead of expectation did more than return to service. It generated additional sorties, additional pressure, and additional choices for commanders already stretched thin. Aircraft availability rose first. Squadrons that would have sat idle ashore remained embarked. Pilots who expected long periods of inactivity instead found themselves briefed again. Engines warming, flight decks alive with motion. Each restored elevator, each patched arresting wire, translated directly into aircraft in the air. Repair became indistinguishable from reinforcement. Carrier groups learned to maintain pressure continuously. There was no longer a natural pause dictated by damage and withdrawal. Operations flowed into one another with little respite. Strikes followed strikes. Reconnaissance never truly stopped. Even when a carrier absorbed damage, it did not vanish from the battle space it dimmed, then brightened again, often before the enemy realized it had been weakened. Japanese planning struggled to adapt. Operational designs assumed gaps, moments when American carrier strength would thin, allowing repositioning or offensive action. These gaps failed to materialize. Where planners expected absence, they encountered resistance. Where they anticipated recovery periods, they found renewed pressure. This persistent presence forced Japan onto the defensive more often and more quickly. Initiative shifted not through a single decisive engagement, but through cumulative imbalance. American commanders could choose when to press and when to conserve, knowing their fleet would not fracture under strain. Japanese commanders, uncertain of enemy availability, lost the ability to predict the rhythm of the war. Logistics, once relegated to the background, became lethal. Repair ships did not fire weapons, but their impact was measured in destroyed aircraft, disrupted plans, and exhausted pilots on the opposing side. Every successful repair shortened the interval between American blows. Every compressed timeline reduced Japan's margin for error. The war's tempo changed accordingly. What had once been a series of discrete operations blurred into a continuous campaign. There was less time to regroup, less time to replace losses, less time to adapt. American endurance forced Japan into reactive postures, responding to threats rather than shaping them. This shift was subtle, almost invisible on maps. Front lines did not leap forward overnight. No single communiqué announced the change. Yet officers on both sides felt it. The war no longer paused to catch its breath. It pressed forward relentlessly, sustained by an infrastructure that refused to fall behind. Repair had ceased to be a supporting function. It was now an active component of combat power, shaping outcomes without appearing on order of battle charts. Steel cut and welded in quiet anchorages determined how many aircraft flew tomorrow and how many targets survived tonight. By the time this reality fully set in, it was too late to reverse. The machinery of recovery was already embedded into American operations, accelerating every engagement that followed. And as the Pacific War ground onward, one truth became unavoidable. The side that could fight, repair, and fight again without pause would dictate not just victories, but the very pace at which the war unfolded. The growing asymmetry did not go unnoticed. Japanese officers observed American carriers returning faster than expected, damage proving temporary rather than decisive. The question emerged naturally: if repair had become a weapon, why not build one of their own? The answer lay not in a single failure, but in the structure of an entire system. Japanese industrial doctrine prized precision and central control. Engineering authority flowed from established arsenals and technical bureaus ashore, where standards were enforced and deviations discouraged. Improvisation, while respected in moments of individual bravery, was not institutionalized as a process. Repair followed procedure. When procedures failed, progress slowed rather than adapted. Repair ships existed, but they were conceived as auxiliaries, not mobile factories. Their tooling was limited, optimized for routine maintenance rather than catastrophic damage. Heavy machine tools were scarce, power generation modest, and storage constrained. These ships could sustain a fleet operating as designed, but not reinvent one under pressure. Spare parts presented a deeper problem. Japanese naval construction emphasized bespoke solutions, finely tuned to individual ship classes. This craftsmanship produced elegant machines, but it resisted standardization. Components were not easily interchangeable. When a part failed, it often had to be replaced by the exact original manufactured in the right yard, by the right specialists, using the right materials. This rigidity extended to authority. Major repair decisions required approval from shore-based commands, far removed from the damage itself. Engineers afloat lacked the mandate to redesign systems or fabricate replacements beyond narrow limits. Even when talent existed, autonomy did not. Initiative waited on permission, and permission waited on reports that crossed oceans. Cultural resistance reinforced these constraints. Deviation from established design was viewed with suspicion. Temporary fixes carried stigma, seen as compromises rather than solutions. The idea of restoring function without full restoration ran counter to deeply held professional standards. Perfection was the goal even when time made perfection unattainable. Distance magnified every weakness. Japan's industrial heartland lay far from the expanding front. Each damaged ship faced a long journey home, consuming fuel, escorts, and time. Forward bases lacked the depth to compensate. Unlike their American counterparts, Japanese fleets could not bring industry with them. They carried only what doctrine allowed. As the war progressed, these limitations hardened into fate. Attempts to adapt came late and unevenly. Tooling shortages persisted. Standardization lagged. Authority remained centralized. Each engagement deepened the disparity, making recovery slower and absence longer. What America solved forward, Japan deferred rearward. The asymmetry became self-reinforcing. American ships returned quickly, maintaining pressure. Japanese ships withdrew and stayed withdrawn, creating gaps that widened with each cycle. One side learned faster because it could afford to fail forward. The other could not. By the time the logic of mobile repair was fully understood, the conditions that made it possible: industrial scale, cultural flexibility, and geographic reach were beyond replication. Japan was not defeated by a single innovation, but by an ecosystem it could not mirror. And as the Pacific War entered its final phase, this imbalance ensured that every loss weighed heavier on one side than the other, locking in an outcome that repair, once neglected, had quietly decided. By the middle years of the Pacific War, an invisible fleet had taken shape beneath the surface of events. It did not appear in victory communiques or dominate post-war photographs. It moved quietly, anchored behind islands with unfamiliar names, or waited offshore beyond the horizon. Yet its presence multiplied American endurance in ways that combat alone never could. These floating machine shops changed the meaning of loss. A damaged carrier was no longer a subtraction from strength, but a temporary reduction measured in hours or days rather than months. Firepower that once vanished after a single strike now re-emerged, reshaped and scarred, but functional. The equation that equated damage with disappearance no longer applied. For Japan, this shift unraveled strategic calculation. Plans built on attrition assumed that each successful attack widened American weakness. Instead, the effect was blunted. Strikes that should have created breathing space produced only brief relief. The American fleet absorbed punishment and returned, again and again, compressing the interval between engagements. Carriers became harder to neutralize, not because they were invulnerable, but because vulnerability no longer guaranteed removal. A flight deck could be burned and patched. Elevators could be damaged and restored to partial use. Systems could run hot, strain beyond design limits, yet still sustain operations. Neutralization required not just damage, but destruction, and destruction was harder to achieve than doctrine had assumed. This reality altered the psychology of warfare. Japanese pilots faced an enemy that refused to stay weakened. Effort no longer correlated cleanly with effect. Courage and skill still mattered, but their returns diminished. Each mission carried the same risk, yet yielded less lasting impact. The war became exhausting in a new way. On the American side, repair crews gained quiet respect. They did not receive decorations for victories in the air. Their names rarely appeared in official histories, yet flight crews understood their importance. Commanders planned with confidence because they knew what waited behind the lines. A damaged ship was not abandoned. It was handed over. The relationship between combat and recovery grew symbiotic. Repair ships learned from each engagement, refining techniques, anticipating damage patterns, pre-positioning materials. Combat fed repair with problems. Repair fed combat with solutions. Together, they created a system that improved with stress rather than degrading under it. Victory became cumulative. Each successful repair shortened the next. Each returned carrier preserved experience, leadership, and cohesion that would otherwise be lost. Losses no longer reset progress. They slowed it briefly. Over time, this compounding advantage overwhelmed any temporary success achieved through destruction alone. The war's geography amplified the effect. In the vast Pacific, distance punished retreat and rewarded persistence. America's ability to remain forward operating, repairing, striking again, turned space into an ally. Japan, forced to pull back damaged ships across thousands of miles, surrendered not just steel, but time. Time emerged as the decisive currency. Firepower could destroy, but only time could sustain pressure. American logistics, once dismissed as background, became the mechanism by which pressure was maintained. The invisible fleet did not win battles directly, but it ensured that battles kept coming. As months passed, the pattern hardened. American carriers appeared where planners expected absence. Operations overlapped instead of pausing. The war lost its rhythm of advance and recovery, and became something closer to a continuous grind, one that favored the side able to endure without interruption. This endurance reshaped outcomes long before final victories were declared. By the time Japan faced decisive defeats, its strategic options had already narrowed beyond recovery. The cumulative effect of staying power had done its work quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. In retrospect, the invisible fleet won something more valuable than territory or tonnage. It won time. Time to adapt, time to learn, time to apply overwhelming strength repeatedly without pause. Firepower delivered the blows, but time determined how many blows could be struck. And in the Pacific War, it was time, not the bomb, not the torpedo that ultimately proved impossible to defeat. As the Pacific War matured, an old myth began to erode. For generations, victory had been imagined as something decided at the point of contact where fire met steel, where courage and tactics were tested in moments of violence. Battles were thought to be decisive because they were visible. The battlefield was where history appeared to turn. But the longer the war continued, the less this belief aligned with reality. Dominance at the moment of engagement proved fleeting. What endured was the ability to return, to repair, to resupply, to resume pressure without delay. The war was no longer decided by who struck hardest in a single encounter, but by who remained functional after repeated ones. Sustainment quietly replaced shock as the foundation of supremacy. Fleets that could remain operational week after week exerted influence far beyond their numerical strength. They dictated tempo, forced reactions, and compressed enemy decision-making. A battle won mattered less if it could not be followed immediately by another. Innovation, in this environment, was no longer measured by dramatic breakthroughs alone. It was measured in uptime. How long could systems remain available? How quickly could failure be reversed? A repaired elevator that restored sortie rates mattered more than a marginal increase in bomb load. Reliability became a form of firepower. America weaponized logistics without naming it as such. Supply, repair, and recovery were treated not as costs to be minimized, but as capabilities to be maximized. The industrial system was extended forward, dispersed, and hardened against disruption. It was designed to function imperfectly under stress, rather than perfectly under ideal conditions. This approach contrasted sharply with Japan's continued emphasis on decisive engagement. The Imperial Navy still sought the battle that would break the enemy's will in a single stroke, but the enemy no longer presented itself as a brittle target. Damage did not accumulate as expected. Victory did not cascade from one success to the next. Japan was fighting yesterday's war, not because its sailors lacked skill or courage, but because its doctrine remained anchored to assumptions that no longer held. It believed destruction was permanent. It believed absence followed damage. It believed that war paused naturally after shock. The Pacific War proved otherwise. Behind the lines, American systems were learning faster than combat could destroy them. Each engagement fed data back into repair processes, logistics planning, and industrial design. Failure became information. Information became adaptation. Adaptation shortened recovery. The loop tightened with every month. This lesson extended beyond the Pacific. Modern war, it became clear, favored societies that could sustain complexity under pressure. Weapon systems grew more intricate. Supply chains lengthened. The margin for error shrank. In such an environment, the decisive advantage belonged not to those who struck hardest once, but to those who could keep striking without interruption. The battlefield remained important, but it was no longer sovereign. What happened behind it shaped everything that followed. Decisions made in workshops, depots, and planning rooms determined whether tactical success translated into strategic effect. War became an endurance contest disguised as a series of battles. Those who understood this survived mistakes. Those who did not were consumed by them. The Pacific War exposed this truth with unforgiving clarity. It rewarded flexibility over perfection, resilience over brilliance, and systems over moments. In the end, wars were not decided by who won the most dramatic encounters. They were decided by who stayed operational the longest, who could absorb loss without surrendering momentum, who could repair faster than the enemy could destroy. And by the time this reality became undeniable, the outcome was already set not on the battlefield, but far behind it, where the quiet work of sustainment had been shaping victory all along. By the final year of the Pacific War, the pattern was unmistakable. American carriers survived battles that, by every earlier standard, should have ended them. They burned, they listed, they withdrew briefly from the line, and then they returned. Scarred, altered, imperfect, but present. The war did not pause for their recovery, and neither did they. These survivals did not look heroic in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic last stands, no singular moments of triumph. Instead, there was continuity. A ship struck down in one engagement appeared again in the next campaign. Damage meant interruption, not erasure. The fleet endured, not because it was invincible, but because it refused to remain absent. The repair ships that made this possible faded back into anonymity as the war moved toward its conclusion. They did not enter harbors under banners. They did not receive victory salutes. When their work was finished, they shifted quietly to the next task, the next hull, the next impossible deadline. Their legacy was measured not in wreckage, but in presence. History would later favor the visible. Pilots climbing into cockpits, admirals studying charts, battles named, dates remembered, victories tallied. These stories mattered, and they deserved to be told. But beneath them ran another narrative, quieter and more decisive, rarely captured in photographs or headlines. Below decks, the real victory hummed. Generators fed welding arcs. Lathes cut steel into new shapes. Men worked by feel and experience, bending metal back into purpose. They did not restore ships to what they had been. They transformed them into what the moment required. Function replaced form. Survival replaced elegance. This work changed the moral logic of the war. It rewarded those who recovered fastest rather than those who struck hardest once. It favored systems that could absorb failure without collapsing. War, in this sense, became less a contest of brilliance than of resilience. Japan destroyed ships. There is no minimizing that fact. Its pilots struck with skill and courage. Its planners sought decisive results through force. But destruction alone could not keep pace with recovery. Time The interval between damage and return became the decisive battlefield. America understood this, even if it never articulated it as doctrine. It counted hours, how long until flight operations resumed, how quickly elevators moved again, how soon a carrier could rejoin the formation. These measurements did not appear on maps, but they governed outcomes all the same. The Pacific War was therefore decided not only by who built more ships, but by who refused to let ships remain broken. It was decided by an industrial culture that accepted imperfection in exchange for continuity, that treated repair as a form of combat, and that understood time as something that could be rebuilt. In the end, the carrier sailed home bearing the marks of their survival. Beneath fresh paint lay welded seams and reinforced frames, evidence of battles fought not only against an enemy, but against the limits of possibility. The repair ships followed them back, their work done, their names already fading. What remained was the lesson. War does not always reward the strongest blow. Often, it rewards the side that stands back up first, the side that returns, the side that turns damage into delay, and delay into nothing at all. They counted ships. America counted hours. And in a war where endurance mattered more than spectacle, time rebuilt, reclaimed, and relentlessly preserved proved to be the most powerful weapon of all.